So American Compass published a book called The New Conservatives. You wrote a review, and I would love it if you could offer a little summary to listeners as to what the book was about and what your review was about.
Yeah, it's interesting for me personally. I debated Orrin Cass, 6 years ago now at the first National Conservatism Conference in Washington in 2019. And it was on the subject of free trade versus industrial policy. And I made the best arguments I could find for free trade. And also, at that time, industrial policy as an idea and concept was still new to many on the right, and there were many people gravitating towards it who were near the Trump administration and near this idea of national conservatism, if you want to call it an idea. And in that moment, it seemed that a lot of things were just being assumed as true. Manufacturing jobs had been eviscerated. We didn't make things in America anymore. Nations that were economically prominent, like Germany, and including our competitor adversary China, all had industrial policies, all favored their manufacturing, had stolen, say, software manufacturing from us, et cetera. And it was interesting when I debated Orrin Cass in 2019. He was an opponent of tariffs, said they were a dumb policy, said protectionism did not achieve the results that he wanted to achieve as a smart advocate for industrial policy and for the government making targeted investments and subsidies towards certain industries and sectors in the economy. And he was also about the worker and the family. And so it was kind of with interest, as I've, various friends of mine, including you, David, who have debated him, and keeping up with Orrin Cass, reading him, and he's now come around to the position that tariffs are actually needed in the American economy. And so with that sort of spirit, I turned to this book, which is, I don't know, maybe 75% essays written by Orrin Cass, but purportedly the book is the collection of scholars as a whole around American Compass. But it's very heavily Orrin Cass. And throughout this book, we have industrial policy, we have pro-union policy, we have the need for Silicon Valley and Washington to be tightly aligned in terms of investment and research. We also have this notion, I'll just say in general, that antitrust should return to the progressive spirit of the early 20th century, which was jettisoned about 50 years ago by free market thinking, because it really can't give you a standard for jurisprudence in evaluating these economic relationships. And so you had courts really making it up or trying to be pro-competitive, but pro-competitive always meant you favored the smallest competitor in the suit, and so you were trying to just aim at decentralization or something like that. And as I read through the book, I just thought, again, there didn't seem to be a lot of critical reviews that I could find. There were some, but it seemed to me I could spend time talking about all the ways in which I disagree with these policies, where I could really focus on what I think is the core position. And I think this position sort of launches into all of the other approaches that American Compass takes. And that is economic policy about the consumer, or is it about the worker? And that is to say, if we focus on the consumer, we're doing something that is inherently to the detriment of American workers and their families and their communities. And I wanted to say, the reason why we're focusing on the consumer is actually because that's the best way we know to be pro-worker. That's how we figure out comparative advantage. That's how we figure out prices. That's how we figure out where to invest. That's how we know where the action is, where goods and services, where's the best place to produce them. All of that sort of thing comes through the choices of consumers. And then sort of the thought, if I don't focus on the consumer and I focus on the worker, well, we're all consumers, but we're not all manufacturing workers, or we're not all workers in this sector or that sector. So inherently, I start playing a government game. I start playing a special interest game. And I start thinking that, this administrative state that we're all rightly oriented against and wary of and wanting to limit. And I think that's one area where the Trump administration has been, for the most part, right. We can quibble about the means in which they've used to do that, but inherently we're going to be relying on the knowledge and the information and the incentives of people in the administrative state to make investments in certain companies and certain sectors of the economy as if they know better than private investors where to put capital. And that just simply is going to, if it does quote unquote work, it's going to be very limited, and it's also going to come with a lot of other costs. And it's also going to involve businesses making what I would think are inherently suboptimal choices about their organization, their labor, their costs, their future pursuits. All of this isn't going to work. And so and it occurs to me as well what's happening with American Compass, what's happening with much of national conservatism, including, I also review another book in the essay by the president of the Heritage Foundation, Kevin Roberts, by Dawn's Early Light, originally entitled Burning Down Washington, now Taking Back Washington. All of these guys are sort of caught up in thinking. They're in this moment that somehow there's a tight nexus between the economy, the virtue, and the government itself. And that's really where we need to be focused on if we want to rebuild our country and our communities and our families. And I think the evidence just isn't there. There's a primary movement in economics in the 19th century in Germany called the German Historical School. They make this same move. And they criticize in ways in which are very similar to the criticisms that people like you and I face now. They criticize the Austrian School of Economics, which at that time is just organizing, because the Austrian school is saying you have to allow the subjective knowledge of the consumer and prices guide economic production. There is no objective way to identify what people are going to do. You have to let them freely associate with one another while you have these concrete protections through the rule of law, force and fraud, all of these sorts of things. But you want to let people freely move around economically. And the German Historical School took from this, we'll use data to form our economic understanding, not theory, not any sort of notion of prices. And once we do that, we'll understand how to reform our countries and make the social sphere work better. And they lose that argument. And when they lose that argument, ultimately in the American sphere and in the British sphere, but they, for certain parts of German history, particularly running up to World War I, they do sort of capture the moment there, which we can talk more about that. And it seemed to me we have to push against that sort of mindset if we're going to prevail and defend our free market in this country, which now faces multiple pressure points.